enslaved human beings in the pre-Civil War period range, depending on the year, between 15 and 20% of the total wealth in the U.S.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're examining 10 times the government ruined Americans' lives.
The Japanese-American experience of World War II left a scar on generations and in the soul of a nation.
For this list, we'll be looking at both specific actions taken, programs enacted, and systemic injustices put in place by the federal government, which took a horrific human toll. While the U.S. government has done plenty of good, it also has many skeletons in its closet. If you've dug up one that's not on our list, let us know in the comments below. McCarthyism.
Live TV coverage provides millions of Americans with their first sustained look at the crusading senator and his bare-knuckle methods.
Around the turn of the 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover began a second Red Scare. They hunted for communists in all areas of society, from the government to Hollywood.
I want to make it clear that the United States Army does not coddle communists. This committee knows that. The American people know that.
The hysteria and fear eventually reached a fever pitch. Hundreds of Americans were sent to prison, while others lost their jobs for refusing to testify before McCarthy in the Senate or the House Un-American Activities Committee. Many of those sent to prison did not, in fact, have any ties to communist organizations, but that didn't matter. Political affiliations and sexual orientations of government employees were put under the microscope before the entire nation. Thousands of lives were destroyed before it all finally came to an end.
It was his investigation of the Army that finally turned public opinion against him and diminished his power.
Forced sterilization of indigenous women. While some may want to consign the mistreatment of Native Americans to ancient history, that couldn't be further from the truth. In the 1960s and 70s, doctors, many of them paid by the U.S. government, forcibly sterilized anywhere between 25 to 40% of Native American women of childbearing age.
They would deem someone feeble-minded, and then in an effort to stop this feeble-mindedness, the goal was to stop them from reproducing.
More often than not, these procedures were done without consent as a state-sponsored act of genocide.
More than 20,000 people were sterilized against their will in the state of California during the 20th century.
Black and Latino women were also targets of similar programs to a lesser degree. The sterilizations capped centuries of efforts to either destroy indigenous populations or erase their identities.
America had hidden the truth from America.
Project MKUltra.
I was given a glass of Kool-Aid, and so were the other children. This Kool-Aid was spiked with LSD.
For 20 years, between 1953 and 1973, the CIA enacted a series of programs culminating in Project MKUltra. 80 colleges and institutions and hundreds of scientists were recruited to participate in illegal experiments on civilians. Biological, chemical, and radiological agents were employed to test mind control and interrogation techniques. LSD was given to college students across the country, often without their knowledge.
You know, what the CIA really dreamed of was sort of like a drug you could give to someone, get them to commit all sorts of unspeakable acts, and they wake up the next day and they don't remember what they've done.
Men who went to brothels in San Francisco were observed through two-way mirrors after being slipped the drug. A sub-project numbered 68 saw psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron operating in Canada to utilize alternative mind control techniques. He employed a combination of drug-induced comas and long-term electroshock therapy to quote-unquote repattern his subjects. He caused permanent damage to patients seeking legitimate care.
Well, there's a lot I could not remember after I got out of the Allen. When my family came, I was a zombie. I didn't even know who they were.
Plessy v. Ferguson.
The Supreme Court's landmark ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson reversed nearly all the civil rights progress made during Reconstruction.
For much of its history, the United States Supreme Court has been a regressive institution, erring towards cementing power structures in the status quo. After the Civil War, Americans saw the largest expansion of civil rights since its founding during the Reconstruction. Revanchist forces in Congress steadily rolled back equal protections in the last 25 years of the 19th century. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson, upholding Louisiana's mandatory segregation.
The Plessy decision is obviously a tremendous setback for African Americans. in the 19th century.
Separate but equal became the law of the land throughout the former Confederacy, condemning generations of African Americans to second-class citizenship.
This gives the go-ahead to segregation in every aspect of Southern life.
Legal segregation would continue until Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. Even so, the ramifications of segregation and practices like redlining continue to be felt today. The Chinese Confession Program.
The first and only time in the entire history of the United States that a group is singled out by name, Chinese, by name, as being undesirable.
Every wave of immigration to the United States has faced the headwinds of bigotry and hatred. Few lasted as long as those faced by the Chinese. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 severely restricted immigration from China. Though it was repealed by FDR in 1943, who called it a, quote, historic mistake, that wasn't the end.
A lot of Americans had a hard time to learn that the Chinese Exclusion Act really exists for 60 years.
Many Chinese Americans lived in the shadows and feared deportation. In 1956, INS and the FBI enacted the Chinese Confession Program. Chinese Americans were offered full citizenship in exchange for confessing to lying about their identities and if they informed their neighbors. Government raids plagued San Francisco's Chinatown, with one playwright calling them acts of, quote, government terrorism. Chinese Americans suffered through almost a decade of fear.
It continues to shape the debate about what it means to be an American to this day.
COINTELPRO. The rise of the civil rights and anti-war movements on the political left led to an institutional backlash in the federal government. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, sanctioned a plan called the Counterintelligence Program, or COINTELPRO. Its goals were to infiltrate and spy on organizations and leaders within these movements to disrupt and destroy them from within.
The FBI had sent around this internal memo. It outlined goals to prevent the coalition of militant black nationalist groups.
Multiple presidents of both parties sanctioned the illegal program. COINTELPRO spread misinformation and splintered organizations like the Black Panthers, leading to some gruesome results. In Chicago, Black Panther Fred Hampton was under observation by the FBI.
They saw him as a greater threat even than Martin Luther King or Malcolm X ever was.
COINTELPRO had decimated the organization, and Hampton was fighting their efforts. In 1969, Hampton was drugged by an FBI informant and subsequently assassinated in his home by Chicago PD. Tuskegee Syphilis Study.
The great shame of the study is that the men thought that they were being treated.
For almost half of the 20th century, the U.S. Public Health Service conducted a terribly unethical and racist medical experiment. The Tuskegee study began in 1932 and ended 40 years later. Without any informed consent whatsoever, 400 black men who were infected with syphilis were test subjects for the U.S. government in a longitudinal study. Despite the discovery of penicillin, none of the men were ever cured of their diseases by the PHS.
The men still didn't know they were sick, and they were not given penicillin. By then, more than 1/3 of the infected men had died.
Before the study's end, 40 of their wives contracted the disease, and 19 of their children were born with congenital syphilis. One of the worst long-term knock-on effects was the pervasive mistrust of both the government and the healthcare system that still permeates black communities today.
In 1997, President Bill Clinton formally apologized to the victims of the study. The president's apology was a welcome first step.
Japanese-American internment. After the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, anti-Japanese sentiment exploded amongst white Americans. Those irrational fears trickled upwards to the top echelons of the U.S. government. Despite the fact that there were Nazi spies and sympathizers in America, it was the Japanese Americans who suffered. The United States forcibly removed over 120,000 Japanese Americans from their homes and relocated them to internment camps until 1946.
The Army provided fleets of vans to transport household belongings and buses to move the people to assembly centers.
Around 2/3 of those interned were Nisei, or second generation born in America. In other words, they were American citizens. The Korematsu decision by the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the internments. It's one of the worst black marks on the history of the court.
The Japanese-American experience of World War II left a scar on generations and in the soul of a nation.
Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears will always taint the legacy of Andrew Jackson, the face of the $20 bill.
He believed that Native Americans were savages and had no rights to their land.
When Native peoples of the American Southeast refused to assimilate, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Approximately 60,000 members of the Cherokee, Muskogee Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations were forcibly displaced from their homelands. In an act of ethnic cleansing, the tribes were sent on an over 1,000-mile forced march west of the Mississippi River. Thousands of men, women, and children suffered miserably and died from disease.
Up to a third of the 15,000 Cherokee who were forced to make the journey died on the way, which is one reason that journey came to be known as the Trail of Tears.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into Settings and switch on your notifications. Slavery. Slavery is often called America's original sin. Textiles and manufactured goods from Europe were brought to West Africa. There, men, women, and children were kidnapped from their homes and bought and sold as property. They were packed like sardines onto slave ships, where many died in wrecks or from disease and starvation.
Once moved below deck, enslaved people would find themselves stuffed into compartments with ceilings as low as 4.5 feet, where they would spend most of their voyage.
When the ships reached the New World, the people were sold to colonists who forced them to pick cash crops like sugar, indigo, rice, tobacco, and cotton. Those goods were sent back to Europe. The economy and foundations of the United States were built on the backs of enslaved Africans and their descendants who were born into bondage.
It really is a testament to the human spirit that African Americans were able to survive that system and ultimately to be able to do great things coming out of that system.